"Sir, with all due respect, I think you're lost." The voice was crisp, condescending, and sharp enough to cut through the humid harbor air. Lieutenant Evans stood with his back ramrod straight at the top of the gangway, his white uniform immaculate against the gray steel of the destroyer. He looked the old man up and down, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The man, who looked to be in his 80s, was dressed in simple slacks and a worn, faded polo shirt. He held a small, scuffed leather satchel in one hand and stood on the pier looking up at the warship with a quiet intensity. He didn't flinch at the lieutenant's dismissive tone. He simply remained still, his gaze calm, his posture possessing a dignity that seemed utterly at odds with his humble appearance. The petty officer of the watch standing nearby shifted his weight, sensing the lieutenant's impatience. "Sir, this is an active United States Navy vessel, the USS Stalwart," Evans continued, his voice rising slightly, projecting for the benefit of the handful of junior sailors milling about. "The public tour was last weekend. I'm going to have to ask you to return to the visitor's center." The old man, Samuel Carter, finally moved. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the ship's superstructure, the advanced radar arrays, the vertical launch system hatches. "She's a fine ship," he said, his voice raspy with age but clear. "A lot more firepower than we had on the Johnston." Evans's face hardened. He mistook the comment for the ramblings of a confused old man. "I'm sure she is. Now I need you to step away from the gangway. You are in a restricted area." He stepped down onto the brow, placing himself physically between Samuel and the ship, a human barrier of starched white cotton and military regulation. "Do you have an access pass? An official escort? Any identification that would permit you to be here?" Samuel looked at the young officer, his eyes the color of a faded sea chart, holding a deep, placid quality. "I was invited," he said simply. "Invited?" Evans let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Invited by whom? The Admiral?" He said it as a joke, a sarcastic flourish to show the sailors watching that he was in complete control. "Yes," Samuel replied, without a hint of irony. "Admiral Hayes." The smirk on the lieutenant's face froze for a second, then returned, more pronounced than before. He was now convinced he was dealing with a dementia case. "Right. Admiral Hayes. Look, sir, the Admiral is a very busy man. He doesn't just hand out personal invitations to wander onto his ships. Now I've been patient. My watch team has actual duties to perform. You need to leave now." A small crowd was beginning to form. Sailors heading for evening liberty slowed their pace, curious about the confrontation. A couple of them, young seamen barely out of their teens, snickered quietly. They saw what the lieutenant saw, a frail old man causing a problem, a minor annoyance in the otherwise orderly routine of the naval base. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel and salt water, punctuated by the distant clang of metal on metal from the shipyard, and the occasional, unintelligible squawk from the ship's 1MC announcing system. It was a world of sharp edges, loud noises, and purposeful hurry, and Samuel Carter seemed to belong to a different, quieter era. "I need to see a name, an access pass or an escort, sir," Evans repeated, his voice now a loud, formal command. He was performing, showing the crew how an officer handles a civilian who doesn't understand the rules. "If you cannot provide one, I will have you escorted from the pier by base security for trespassing." Samuel's calm demeanor remained unbroken, but a shadow of profound disappointment passed over his features. He wasn't angry. He was sad. Sad for the boy in the pristine uniform who couldn't see past it. He clutched his old leather satchel a little tighter. It was cracked and weathered, the color of dried blood in some places, the brass fittings green with age. "What's in the bag, Pop?" Evans sneered, gesturing toward the satchel with a flick of his chin. "Scrapbook. Old photos. You can show them to the guards when they get here." Samuel didn't answer. He simply looked at the bag in his hands, his knuckles white. He was a man out of time, his quiet insistence a disruption to the modern Navy's clockwork precision. The lieutenant's frustration was boiling over. He saw the watching eyes of his sailors, and his authority felt challenged by this silent, stubborn old man. He felt a need to end this, decisively. "I've given you a lawful order to vacate this area," Evans said, his voice ringing with self-importance. "You have failed to comply. You are interfering with naval operations and presenting a security concern." He turned to the petty officer of the watch. "Call base security. Tell them we have a trespasser at the main gangway, possibly disoriented. Have them send a vehicle." The petty officer hesitated for a beat too long, an almost imperceptible reluctance in his eyes. "Hey, sir," he finally said, reaching for his radio. The circle of onlookers grew tighter. They could sense the confrontation was reaching its climax. The young officer, puffed up with the power of his rank, was about to have an old man forcibly removed. It felt wrong, but no one dared to contradict a commissioned officer in the middle of the quarterdeck. The tension on the pier was a palpable thing, a coiled spring of embarrassment and misplaced authority. Samuel Carter stood at the center of it all, a silent statue of a forgotten time, his hand resting on the worn leather of his satchel, waiting. He had waited before, in far worse places than this. He could wait a little longer. Evans gestured dismissively at the worn leather satchel again. Seriously, what could possibly be in that old thing that's so important? The world seemed to dissolve for a moment, the sounds of the pier fading into a dull roar. The scent of salt and diesel was replaced by the acrid stench of smoke and burning fuel. The polished gray deck of the USS Stalwart became the bucking, tilting plates of the USS Johnston, slick with seawater and oil. A young Samuel Carter, his face smudged with soot and his sailor's uniform torn, was in a smoke-filled compartment deep within the dying destroyer. Alarms blared, a constant shrieking chorus of doom. Outside, the thunder of enemy naval guns was a physical force, shaking the very bones of the ship. He clutched the very same satchel to his chest. It wasn't filled with photos, it was heavy with the salvation of other men. Inside was a captured Japanese codebook and a hastily scrawled list of targeting coordinates for the enemy fleet, pulled from a wrecked communications station. His lieutenant, dying on the deck, had pressed it into his hands. "Get this to the bridge, Carter. That's an order." But the bridge was gone, obliterated by a direct hit. He had to get to the auxiliary radio room, 3 decks down, through a labyrinth of fire and flooding. The satchel was everything. It was a promise, a mission, a lifeline for thousands of sailors who didn't even know they were depending on him. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. He was back on the sun-drenched pier in San Diego. His hand was still resting on the satchel. His gaze, distant for a fraction of a second, refocused on the sneering face of Lieutenant Evans. The audience of sailors had grown larger, a silent theater of uniformed spectators. The injustice of the scene was a bitter taste in the air. From a position near the ship's services connection point, Chief Petty Officer Miller watched the scene unfold. A 20-year veteran with a face like a topographical map of every sea he'd ever sailed, Miller had an instinct for trouble. He didn't know the old man, but he knew men like him. He'd seen them at VFW halls and on memorial days. They carried a certain weight, a stillness that command-hungry young officers often mistook for weakness. He also knew Lieutenant Evans, a man who worshipped the rulebook but had no feel for the spirit behind the rules. Miller's sharp ears had picked up the key phrases through the humid air: Admiral Hayes, and the old man's name, Carter. It was the combination of the name, the Admiral's mention, and the old man's unshakable, quiet dignity that tripped a wire in the chief's brain. While Evans was posturing, puffing out his chest and escalating the situation, Miller acted. Trusting a gut honed by years of navigating far more dangerous situations, he moved away from the prying eyes of the junior sailors, turning his back to the confrontation. He pulled out his personal cell phone, scrolling through his contacts with a calloused thumb. He didn't call base security. That would only make things worse, burying the situation in paperwork and official reports. He had a better number. He called the direct line of the Admiral's personal aide, a master chief he had served with on the Abraham Lincoln. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Master Chief," Miller said, his voice low and urgent. "It's Chief Miller, over on the Stalwart. Sorry to bother you on this line, but we have a developing situation at the gangway." He quickly and quietly relayed the facts, keeping his description neutral but clear. "Lieutenant Evans is about to have an elderly civilian removed from the pier. He's being overly officious." Miller chose his words carefully. "The thing is, Master Chief, the gentleman said his name was Samuel Carter, and he said he was invited by Admiral Hayes." There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. Miller could hear the faint, muffled sound of a meeting in the background. Then nothing. "Chief," the Master Chief's voice came back. "All business now, stripped of any pleasantry. What was that name again?" "Carter. Samuel Carter," Miller repeated. Another pause, this one charged with an electric tension. "Keep him there," the Master Chief ordered, his voice suddenly strained. "Do not, I repeat, do not let that man leave the pier. Use any means necessary to delay base security. The Admiral is on his way." The line went dead. Chief Miller lowered the phone, his eyes wide. "The Admiral is on his way." He turned to look back at the gangway. The situation had worsened. Lieutenant Evans, his patience finally shredded, was making his final irrevocable error. The audience on the pier, and now the audience of this story, could sense that justice was no longer a hope. It was an inevitability, barreling down the pier like a torpedo. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled confines of the Strike Group Command headquarters, the contrast with the chaotic pier could not have been more stark. Wood-paneled walls were adorned with maps and naval art. Admiral Thomas Hayes, a formidable man whose 2 stars were earned in the deserts of the Middle East and the tumultuous waters of the South China Sea, was presiding over a logistics briefing. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the low murmur of professional discourse. His aide, Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne, entered the room without knocking, a breach of protocol so severe that every officer at the long conference table fell silent. "Admiral," Thorne said, his voice tight. "Apologies for the interruption. An urgent call from Chief Miller on the USS Stalwart." Admiral Hayes looked up, his brow furrowed in irritation at the interruption. "What is it, Master Chief?" "Sir, there is a civilian, an elderly gentleman, at the gangway of the Stalwart. Lieutenant Evans is denying him access to the ship." Hayes waved a dismissive hand. "Then have the captain handle his lieutenant. This isn't a flag-level issue." "Sir," Thorne pressed, stepping closer. "The civilian's name is Samuel Carter." The name hung in the air like a ghost. The pen in Admiral Hayes's hand stopped its idle tapping. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze locking with his aide's. The irritation in his eyes was replaced by stunned disbelief, which then morphed into a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. The other officers in the room exchanged confused glances, sensing the sudden seismic shift in the atmosphere. "Carter," the Admiral whispered, the name a fragile thing on his lips. "Sam Carter is on my pier." "Yes, Admiral," Thorne confirmed. "And Lieutenant Evans is—" Hayes's voice became dangerously calm, the quiet before a hurricane. "Is what, Master Chief?" "Refusing him entry, sir. According to Chief Miller, he is treating Mr. Carter poorly." The Admiral shot to his feet, his heavy chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The sudden movement made everyone flinch. "Get the captain of the Stalwart on the line now," he commanded, his voice a low growl of thunder. "And get my cover. I'm going down there myself." "Master Chief, you're with me." The controlled, professional environment of the briefing room had evaporated, replaced by an urgent, almost frantic energy. Everyone in that room knew something of monumental importance was happening, even if they didn't know why. For the audience, the secret was now revealed. Samuel Carter was not just an old man. He was a figure of such significance that his mere presence could command the personal, immediate attention of a 2-star admiral. Back on the pier, Lieutenant Evans was at the end of his rope. Samuel Carter's quiet refusal to be intimidated or dismissed had become a personal affront to his authority. The old man hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a threat. It was infuriating. "That's it," Evans announced, his voice tight with anger. He felt the eyes of the crew on him and knew he had to act. "I have had enough of this senile fantasy. You are a security risk." He pointed a finger at 2 young seamen who had been watching from the side. "You and you. Place your hands on this gentleman. We are detaining him for trespassing on a federal installation and for failing to obey a lawful order. Escort him to the quarterdeck office. We'll get him a nice, comfortable psych evaluation and let the professionals sort him out." The 2 young sailors, barely 18 years old, looked at each other, then at the frail old man. A wave of profound unease washed over them. This was an order, but it felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. To put their hands on this dignified, quiet man seemed like a desecration. The crowd of sailors murmured its disapproval, a low rumble of dissent. This had gone too far. Just as the reluctant sailors took a hesitant step forward, Samuel Carter finally spoke again. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with the clarity of a ship's bell in a heavy fog. "Son," he said, his eyes locked on Lieutenant Evans, "I would advise you not to do that." There was no malice in his tone, no threat. It was a simple, stark statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a lifetime of experience. This quiet, calm piece of advice was the final straw for Evans. To him, it was the ultimate act of defiance. "Are you threatening me?" Evans sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "That's it. You're under." He never finished the sentence. A new voice, sharp and laced with absolute authority, sliced through the air like a blade. "Lieutenant Evans, stand down." Every head on the pier snapped in the direction of the voice. Striding down the concrete pier with a look of cold fury was the captain of the USS Stalwart, a man known for his stern demeanor. Jogging to keep pace just behind him was a relieved-looking Chief Miller. But they were not the main event. Behind them, a black government sedan with official flags on its fenders had screeched to a halt, its tires protesting against the pavement. The rear door flew open and out stepped Admiral Thomas Hayes. He slapped his combination cover onto his head and moved with a purpose that scattered sailors like pigeons. He was flanked by his aide, Master Chief Thorne, and 2 United States Marines in their immaculate dress blue uniforms, who moved with the silent, formidable presence of palace guards. The effect was instantaneous and total. The murmuring crowd fell into a sudden, shocked silence. A wave of motion rippled through the assembled sailors as every single one of them snapped to rigid attention, their right hands flying up in salute. The air, which moments before had been filled with tension and chatter, was now heavy with a deafening, respectful silence. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against the ship's hull, the distant cry of a gull, and the rhythmic, angry clack of the Admiral's polished shoes on the concrete pier. Admiral Hayes was a man on a mission. He walked past the saluting sailors without a glance. He walked past his own ship's captain as if he were a statue. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, swept over Lieutenant Evans, who stood frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated terror, his hand half raised in a pathetic, trembling salute. The Admiral didn't even acknowledge his existence. His entire focus, his entire being was directed at one person. He came to a stop directly in front of Samuel Carter. The 2-star Admiral and the old man in the faded polo shirt stood face to face, a foot of air separating them. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. The Admiral's hard, angry face seemed to soften, the fury replaced by a look of profound respect and something akin to awe. Then, in a movement that was both swift and deeply reverent, Admiral Hayes brought his hand up to his brow in the sharpest, most meaningful salute Lieutenant Evans had ever witnessed. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a junior. It was the salute one gives to a head of state, to a living monument. "Mr. Carter," the Admiral said, his voice thick with an emotion that reverberated across the silent pier. "Sam, it is an honor to finally meet you. Welcome aboard the USS Stalwart." He held the salute, his arm rigid, his gaze locked on the old man. The entire pier held its breath. Samuel Carter, the man who had been dismissed as a lost and confused senior, slowly, almost reluctantly, raised his hand in a small, acknowledging nod. He had not sought this attention, but he accepted the respect it conveyed. The Admiral dropped his salute and turned to face the assembled crew, his expression once again hard as granite. His voice, now amplified by pure command presence, boomed across the flight deck and down the pier. "For those of you who have been wondering," he began, his eyes sweeping over the young, bewildered faces, "allow me to provide some education. This is Mr. Samuel Carter." He paused, letting the name sink in. In October of 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the destroyer USS Johnston was sailing into the guns of the entire Japanese center force. A Taffy 3 ship, hopelessly outgunned, fighting like a battleship. During that action, the Johnston took a catastrophic hit that destroyed her bridge and main communications. Her commanding officer, Commander Ernest Evans, was gravely wounded. The Admiral gestured with his hand toward the worn leather satchel still clutched in Samuel's hand. At that moment, then Signalman Second Class Carter, on his own initiative, left his station, navigated through fire and flooding into the compromised Combat Information Center, and retrieved the last known coordinates of the enemy fleet. He carried them in this very satchel, through a ship that was being torn apart around him, to a small auxiliary radio station. He transmitted that intelligence to the rest of the task force just moments before the Johnston rolled over and sank. The Admiral's voice grew louder, filled with a fierce pride. That single transmission, that one act of incredible bravery by a 19-year-old sailor on a sinking ship, is directly credited with saving the carriers USS Fanshawe Bay and USS White Plains. His actions helped save the lives of over 5,000 American sailors that day. Mr. Carter was in the water for 3 days, wounded and surrounded by sharks before he was rescued. He is a recipient of the Navy Cross. He turned his head, and his gaze fell upon Lieutenant Evans like a physical blow. Mr. Carter is not a guest, he is a living legend. He was invited here today by me, personally, to be the guest of honor for this ship's heritage celebration. He has more right to stand on the deck of a United States Navy warship than any single one of us here. He earned that right in blood and fire. A wave of shame washed over the crowd of sailors. The smirks and whispers were gone, replaced by expressions of awe and deep, profound respect. The 2 young seamen who had been ordered to detain Samuel looked as though they wanted the pier to open up and swallow them whole. They were staring at Samuel Carter not as an old man but as a giant. The Admiral's piercing gaze remained fixed on Lieutenant Evans. The temperature on the pier seemed to drop several degrees. His voice was no longer booming for the crowd, but had lowered into a chilling, personal growl meant only for the terrified young officer. "Lieutenant," he said, the word dripping with contempt, "you wear the uniform of a naval officer. Your primary duty is not to blindly enforce regulations, it is to exercise sound judgment and lead your sailors. You looked at this man and all you saw was an old civilian. You failed to see the character. You failed to see the history. You failed to see the hero standing right in front of your face. He took a step closer, his voice dropping even further. You confused your meager authority with actual power, and you used it to humiliate a man to whom you and I both owe an immeasurable debt. You have not only insulted a national hero, Lieutenant, you have disgraced your commission. You have failed your shipmates, and you have failed the Navy. He pointed a rigid finger toward the ship. Report to the captain's cabin. You and I and the captain will be having a very long, very detailed discussion about your future in my Navy. A future which at this moment is looking remarkably short. Move. White as a sheet and trembling visibly, Lieutenant Evans could only stammer, "Aye, aye, Admiral." He turned and practically fled up the gangway, the eyes of every sailor on the pier burning into his back. As the disgraced officer disappeared into the ship, Samuel Carter took a slow step forward and placed a gentle, wrinkled hand on the Admiral's rigid forearm. "Admiral," he said softly. "Tom, the boy, he's young. He was just protecting his post. He's proud of this ship, proud of his uniform. Perhaps a little too enthusiastic in his duties, but his heart was in the right place. It was just pointed in the wrong direction." Samuel looked around at the faces of the young sailors, all of them still standing at rigid attention, their expressions a mixture of awe and contrition. "Honor isn't about the shine on your shoes or the sharpness of your salute," he said, his voice carrying a teacher's gentle wisdom. "It's about what you do when the choices are hard. It's about seeing the person, not the vessel they arrive in. He's a young man. He'll learn." The Admiral looked from Samuel's face down to the hand on his arm, then to the ancient leather satchel. As Samuel spoke, a final brief image flickered through his mind, a memory, sharp as shrapnel. He was 19 again on the listing deck of the Johnston. His dying commanding officer, Commander Evans, was propped against a bulkhead, his lifeblood staining the steel plates. He pressed the satchel into Sam's hands. "Get this to them, Carter," the commander had gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "Whatever it takes, that's an order. Make it count." The weight of that promise, of that blood-soaked leather, had been with him ever since. Back in the present, Admiral Hayes looked at Samuel Carter and understood the profound depth of the grace he had just offered. The Admiral personally escorted Samuel Carter up the gangway and onto the deck of the USS Stalwart. As they reached the quarterdeck, the ship's captain called the crew to attention over the 1MC, and every available sailor mustered on the flight deck in a matter of minutes. There, in front of his entire command, the captain offered a formal public apology to Mr. Carter on behalf of the ship and its crew, his voice cracking with sincere regret. The fallout for the former Lieutenant Evans was significant, but it was not punitive. It was educational. Admiral Hayes, true to Samuel's wisdom, decided that shame was a poor teacher, but humility was an invaluable one. Evans was not discharged. Instead, he was reassigned. For the next 6 months, he was ordered to report for duty at the local Veterans Affairs Hospital. He was not there as an officer. He was there as a volunteer. His duty was to escort patients to their appointments, to bring them water, and most importantly, to sit and listen to their stories. He traded his crisp white uniform for a simple polo shirt and slacks, and in the quiet halls of the VA, surrounded by the living history of men like Samuel Carter, he began to learn the difference between regulation and respect. The Navy also learned a lesson. A new training module titled Living Heritage was developed and mandated fleet-wide, using the anonymized incident as a powerful case study in situational awareness and leadership. Several months later, in a quiet neighborhood coffee shop miles from the naval base, a man in civilian clothes sat nursing a cup of coffee. It was Evans. He looked different. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. He looked up and saw Samuel Carter sitting alone at a small table by the window, slowly reading a newspaper, his old leather satchel resting on the chair beside him. Evans watched him for a long moment, a storm of emotions churning within him. He finally stood, took a deep breath, and walked over to the old man's table. Samuel looked up as he approached. Evans said nothing at first. He simply walked to the counter, bought a fresh cup of coffee, and placed it gently on Samuel's table. "Mr. Carter," Evans said, his voice quiet and steady, "I just wanted to thank you." Samuel Carter looked up, his sea-blue eyes holding a spark of recognition and warmth. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a calm acceptance. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son," he said, a small knowing smile touching his lips. "Tell me what you've learned." Samuel Carter's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest heroes don't always wear a uniform you can see. Their valor is etched in their character, a quiet strength that endures. If you were moved by his story of dignity and grace, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming courage. Thank you for watching.